Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. More about them in just a moment.
A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Religious debates are often framed as a clash between atheists and theists. On the one hand, there are the Dawkins, Harrises and Hitchens of the world, and on the other, there are the Aquinas, the Fazers and the Craigs. But seldom does the middle path get nearly as much consideration. There are not many who will boldly take to the stand to say, I'm not sure about the whole God thing, I haven't made my mind up. But luckily, David Hume will come to our rescue. In his Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, he looks at the question of God not just through the eye of an atheist or a theist, but rather an outright curmudgeonly skeptic who wishes to show the limits of what we could ever know about the divine. Get ready to learn the constraints of human reason, the importance of the relationship between knowledge and truth, and why we could all stand to re-examine our ideas of what is metaphysically possible. As always, bear in mind that I'm only really scratching the surface of Hume's philosophy and the wider debate around agnosticism here, and there are responses to each of his points, which I won't have time to examine in detail. Just know that they are there. None of Hume's arguments are knockdown objections. But before any of that, I want to thank the very kind sponsor for this video, Squarespace. If you are looking to build a website, then you'll know it's a bit of a pain. First, you have to choose a domain, and then there's the matter of designing the thing. And I'm no web designer, so I live in the perpetual insecurity that it all just looks unprofessional and rubbish. But this is where Squarespace is incredibly helpful. They combine all of that into a single platform, and their templates are fantastic for forming the basis of your own website design. I'm almost done using it to build my own website, and it's made the whole process significantly less stressful. And saved me a lot of time, which generally I'm in short supply of. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain name or a website. But anyway, back to God. 1. The limits of analogy. Out of all of the tools of human reasoning, I think analogy is one of the least appreciated. It's very cool, and in some ways, I don't know what we would do without it. In the beauty of intricate formal systems and probabilistic inductive reasoning, we can forget the amazing fact that we can go, this thing is a bit like this other thing, maybe it will behave in the same way. And we rely on this thinking a fair amount for good reason. In some ways, straightforward inductive reasoning often relies on analogies just like this. For instance, we make generalizations about watches because we know that watches are all alike in a whole host of ways. Thus, it makes sense to group them under the term watch and start to make semi-universal statements about the class of watches. And a huge amount of arguments for belief in God rely on some form of analogical reasoning. Classically, the argument for design often goes a bit like this. In general life, whenever we encounter something sufficiently complex, we tend to infer that there is some designer. Paley famously uses the example of a watch on a beach. If we came across such an object, we would not think, wow, I wonder how this watch came to be via the interaction of the sand, the wind, and the sea. We would instead think, someone must have made this watch. There must have been a watchmaker. However, the universe itself is vastly more complex than a watch, so much so that even our most advanced mathematical theories cannot come up with a complete description of it. So, because the universe is a bit like a significantly more intricate and complicated watch, should we not, by the same token, infer that it too must have a designer? For another example, we might take a particular formulation of the cosmological argument. This might say that since everything we've observed in the universe has a beginning and also a cause, and the universe is also a thing analogous to all of the objects we've already observed, then that must also have a cause. In both cases, there is the general idea that the universe itself is similar enough to the stuff in the universe that we can generalize from observations about intra-universe objects to the universe itself. It's a bit like a suppressed premise in the argument. I want to note here that there are versions of both of these arguments that are not analogical in this way, but they also tend to rely on a priori metaphysical principles that are open to question and require defense. You can check out my video on St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways if you want to learn a little bit more about that. However, one of the characters in Hume's dialogue, Philo, throws this type of reasoning into question. He asks whether we can actually justify our analogy here, arguing that, at best, we have very limited reasons to think that the universe itself must be like anything within it. After all, there are plenty of instances where the members of some set have properties that do not belong to the set itself. Think of a square made up of 2 triangles. While everything inside the square has the property of having 3 sides, the square itself obviously does not. Or, to take a starker example, everything in the set of reptiles is an animal, but the set of reptiles isn't anything living at all. We see these disanalogies between groups and their members all the time. It might be the case that no individual member of a community is self-sufficient, but the community itself may be perfectly self-sufficient. Many single-coloured objects can form a multi-coloured composite, and so on. The point Philo is getting at is that the analogic leap the theist makes in the argument from design or the cosmological argument are not nearly as secure as we might initially think. It's worth noting here that this is not a positive argument for atheism at all. It's not suggesting that the analogy definitely does not hold. Whereas something like the problem of evil attempts to identify a positive tension in the proposed properties of God, and thus make an active argument for his non-existence, Philo is simply introducing doubt into the common patterns of our theological reasoning. This is sort of emblematic of Hume's general approach. David Hume is one of the closest things we find in modern philosophy to a proper skeptic. He spent much of his life attempting to find the limits of what humans can be certain of, and the extent to which our senses, reason, and thoughts can lead us astray. His essays on a huge number of topics all make the same broad point. Our reasoning is much less clear than we think it is. And this attitude makes him a fantastic spokesman for something like agnosticism. In effect, Philo wants to know what the limits of reasoning by analogy are, and how we know when we've gone too far. His proposed answer is actually very intuitive. Reasoning by analogy holds just to the extent to which the objects of comparison are similar in the relevant ways. So, if we are reasoning about movement, then we can expect two things of similar weight and shape to move in similar ways. But then the question this raises for the theist is this: how similar can we truly say the objects in the universe are to the universe itself? And thus, how justified is this analogical reasoning? For the record, Philo's criticisms do not just apply to religious answers, but just any sort of response to the question, what was there before the universe, or what caused the universe? Or any question that addresses things outside of the world we inhabit. In many ways, his attack is not actually on theism itself, but rather the comprehensibility of the question that theism has set out to answer. This is going to become a bit of a theme. Philo is far more a skeptic than an atheist. He is less concerned with whether theism is a good theory, but more with whether this sort of metaphysical theory crafting even makes sense. And, having taken issue with the arguments for the existence of God, Philo then moves to attack God's nature. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my Patreon. The link is in the description. 2. The problem of understanding God. To massively simplify some fascinating history, in medieval Christian thought, there were two primary types of theology: revealed theology, which dealt with direct revelations from God, like Scripture, and natural theology, which attempted to find out about God through the world itself. That is, revealed theology dealt with his words, and natural theology dealt with his works. And it is worth saying, this was a huge part of theology. Much of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, arguably the greatest work of Christian theology in history, is about inferring the properties of God from nature. And natural theology has numerous strengths that revealed theology does not quite have access to. For instance, if a Christian theologian is talking to someone who does not already believe in the divine inspiration of the Bible, then they are unlikely to be amenable to arguments from revealed theology. But almost everyone believes the natural world exists, so it's a fantastic place to start. The two other main characters in Hume's dialogue, Cleanthes and Demea, both make natural theological arguments at various points. In particular, Demea wishes to argue for a transcendent God with infinite properties. He is not just good, but infinitely good. Not just intelligent, but infinitely intelligent. He is boundless and eternal and woven through everything in existence. In itself, this is a slightly esoteric, but not too unorthodox characterization of God. A lot of conceptions of a theistic deity make many of his properties infinite, and almost all of them make him significantly greater than humans. This makes a lot of sense. What would be the point of worshipping something that was not a whole lot greater than us? But this is where Philo begins his critique. He points out that a theistic worldview must be very careful to balance two properties of God. On the one hand, he must be so much greater than us mere humans, but on the other, he must remain comprehensible to us in some way. After all, if we could not know anything about God, then a theistic worldview would not be that much different from an atheistic one. It would simply amount to saying, well, there is something out there, but I don't know what it is. But Philo is quick to remark that God's greatness is at odds with his knowability. An example might help illustrate what he means. For instance, imagine that you were not you, but instead a beetle, and you were happily crawling around the floor when one day you come across the complete works of Shakespeare. From one perspective, you now know the complete works of Shakespeare exists as a physical object. But from another, you only do so in a highly limited way. You cannot tell that it's a book, but basically treat it like you would a brick. You cannot understand the language contained within, nor the meter, nor the dramatic beats. In fact, you can't really get any of the information encoded inside at all. There is a sense in which Beetle you would not believe in the complete works of Shakespeare, but instead only that there is some object on the floor and that its details will be forever beyond your grasp. Philo's argument is essentially that if God is as great as the reports claim and is infinite, then he must be almost entirely beyond human comprehension. After all, to understand a finite amount of an infinite being would still be to understand only an infinitesimally small amount about him. In some ways, Philo echoes what many Christian theologians have themselves stated. According to Christian legend, St. Augustine was once admonished by an angel, who told him that attempting to understand God's Trinitarian nature via human reason was like attempting to fit the entire ocean in a small hole on the beach. Others have said that when we call God kind or loving or talk of his wrath, we must be speaking by analogy. We're just saying the closest thing that humans can think of. However, for Philo, this means that the theist is not really believing in one definite God at all. This point is going to get a bit technical, so bear with me. Let's think about belief in terms of considered possibilities. Then we can say that what you believe is what you think is true in every possibility you are considering. So if I believe that London is the capital of the UK, then that means that in every possibility I will consider, London will be the capital of the UK. I won't consider any possibilities in which this is not true, because then my belief could not serve as the basis for decisive action. On the other hand, if something is an open possibility for me, then it will be true in at least one of the possibilities that I'm considering. So if I know that my friend John is either in Manchester or in Birmingham, but I don't know which, then they are both open possibilities for me. One of the possibilities I'm considering has John in Birmingham, and the other has him in Manchester. Funnily enough, I did my master's thesis in epistemic logic, and this is pretty much how logicians tend to treat belief mathematically. Philo's point is partly that if God remains mostly incomprehensible, then the theist does not really believe in one whole definite God, but rather considers a whole load of different gods as open possibilities, corresponding to all of the possible qualities of God that are forever beyond their reach. At its extreme end, this approaches something that is atheism adjacent, like what we were saying earlier about someone believing that there is something out there but they don't know what it is. But Philo's problem is really one of gradation. The greater the God, the more difficult he would be to comprehend. But the more difficult to comprehend, the harder it is to believe in anything definite. It's a fun little conundrum, though I do think there are solutions to it. In practice, most religions get around this by using revealed theology. If you are a Christian, then God has informed you about himself directly through holy texts. But Hume is largely concerned with natural theology here, for the reasons I gave at the beginning of the section. Whether or not you agree with it, this is quite a cool argument to think about because it helps illustrate the connection between ontology and epistemology. Ontology is the study of what is, whereas epistemology is the study of how we come to know things. On the traditional Aristotelian picture, epistemology rests upon ontology, and this makes sense. How we gain knowledge will depend on how the world is, and thus on ontology. However, Hume points out a flip side to this. The ontology that we can believe in rests upon what we can know and what we can comprehend. In other words, what it is possible to believe depends on what it is possible to understand. And thus, Hume raises an interesting question for theists. Even if we grant that God exists, to what extent must we remain agnostics about his nature? And furthermore, does this mean that we would not be believing in one definite God, but rather gesturing at a whole host of possible gods and saying, well, one of them must exist? That was all pretty heavy-going stuff, and to anyone who's interested, I would truly recommend looking into epistemic logic. It's a fascinating field. Next, we will look at a different but related idea that Hume raises at numerous points during his dialogue. How should our reasoning change when we are talking about things so far outside the realm of our ordinary experience? 3. Possibilities, plausibility, and you. To return to the concept of natural theology, many arguments in that field tend to go something like this. You observe a property in the world, and then you ask, what would be the most plausible way to explain this? And then you conclude something about God, or just the mere fact that God exists. This is a very familiar pattern of reasoning known as abduction, or an inference to the best explanation. For instance, if I had left my laptop in public and it was gone when I came back, any number of things could have happened. A group of pigeons could have coordinated to carry it away. A gust of wind could have blown it to where I cannot see it. But the disappearance of my laptop is probably best explained by the hypothesis that someone has stolen it. Cleanthes makes many such arguments of this structure in the dialogue. Most notably, he uses a variant on the argument from design and the fine-tuning argument to show God's existence and his supreme intelligence. Cleanthes first points out that the universe has an astonishing amount of order in it. The natural laws keep everything reliable and predictable. If anything was even slightly off, then there would be total and complete chaos. It could have been that gravity was slightly different, and as a result, planets would not hold together. It could have been the case that natural laws were unstable and unreliable. They could have stopped one day in 1350 and destroyed the universe in that very moment. Cleanthes then says that the best way to explain such a delicate balance is that there is a highly intelligent agential designer who carefully crafted these laws, and we call that designer God. The alternative is that they came about by chance, and that just seems absurd. So, God is the most sensible option. Thus, via abduction, it is rational to believe in God. There is something very appealing about this line of argument, but Philo, in classic fashion, raises some important skeptical challenges. In his view, there is a significant impediment to using abductive reasoning to answer questions about God or the ultimate causes of the universe, and it essentially arises from a paucity of data. For Philo, the reason that abduction works in the world of everyday life is because we have an awful lot of experience to draw from to compare different explanatory theories. Take the example of my laptop. I know from previous encounters with pigeons that they are unlikely to have coordinated to nick it, because I'm not even sure that they could do such a thing, and even if they could, they would not have anything to gain by doing so. Likewise, the idea that a gust of wind specifically blew my laptop out of sight while leaving the surrounding area untouched seems implausible because I know that that's not the type of thing that wind does. On the other hand, I know that when people leave things unattended, sometimes they are stolen. It is a much more plausible hypothesis than the other two options I was considering. Essentially, underlying my abductive reasoning is a whole load of background knowledge and defeasible rules that I rely on to make the inference function. The philosopher John Norton calls these things material rules, and he uses them quite a lot in his own theory of induction. But then, Philo raises a pretty sensible question. What can we possibly base our plausibility judgments on in arguments like the fine-tuning one? A premise of the fine-tuning argument is that the universe could have been a whole host of other ways. There is a sense in which this is true. It is logically possible that the universe could have been made entirely out of cheese or consist only of maths or any number of things. But all that says is that it wouldn't be contradictory for the universe to be like this. But to say something is non-contradictory and to say that it could have metaphysically happened are two different things. In effect, Philo is saying that we have no idea about the possible ways the universe could have been because we only have access to this one. For all we know, this is the only way the universe could have ever been, or it is, in fact, the worst organized out of all of the possible universes that could be. Philo is not saying that either of these is the case, he is just saying we have no way of telling. Again, it is less an atheist point than an agnostic one. Philo is throwing his skeptical gauntlet down at any sort of talk about the way the universe could have been. Because, according to him, we have no experience of the material rules at play here, so we cannot really make any judgments about possibility, plausibility, or probability. Moreover, he points out the same argument can be applied to an intelligent God as the best way to explain how the universe is. Since we've never seen anything outside the universe, how can we say that an intelligent God is more plausible than other competing theories? Offhandedly, Philo raises a whole set of alternative hypotheses to explain why the world might be orderly, including God is just very prolific and came to the orderliness of this universe via trial and error. The universe was formed via a committee of a whole load of intelligences. Or the universe was not made by an agent at all, but instead a supremely sophisticated mechanistic force. Now, Cleanthes, and indeed any theist, could respond here by saying that the hypothesis of an intelligent God just seems simpler and more plausible. But Philo's whole point is that our plausibility judgments formed from our experiences in this world are entirely inappropriate to discussing what is plausible outside of this world. It would be like me learning to play football and assuming that every other game must follow the same rules. Again, Philo is not saying that God definitely doesn't exist. His scope is so much broader than that. He is suggesting that our epistemic position is so limited that almost any definite judgment we make about the metaphysical beginnings of the universe or its alleged creator are going to be tentative at best and complete guesses at worst. His issue is not with the theistic hypothesis in particular, but rather with this sort of metaphysical theorizing in general. And I want to finish by examining this point in further detail. because I think it presents very interesting questions that often go unacknowledged in theological discussions, but nonetheless, ones we might want to approach before we start making broad proclamations or asserting theories. 4. Knowledge, belief, and doubt. Perhaps David Hume's most famous idea is that all knowledge can be divided into matters of fact, which are contingent observations about the world, which we can, in principle, check, and relations of ideas, which are mathematical and logical truths that we can know simply by analysing the definitions of the concepts involved. He then declared that anything that does not fall into one of these two camps is either nonsense or just beyond human comprehension, and so it must be committed to the flames. And this is classic Hume. He was just as much concerned with what we can know as what is the case. Of course, fundamentally, the debate between atheism and theism is about what is the case. One side has the proposition there is no God, and the other side has the proposition there is a God. It's a very familiar structure. It's just two propositions that contradict one another. Just how I might argue with someone over whether aliens exist or over whether my table exists. However, in a lot of ways, agnosticism seems slightly different, because a committed agnostic, if that makes any sense at all, is not making a claim about what exists, but rather what can be known. Its scope is epistemological rather than ontological. It also seems like someone can be agnostic to a greater or lesser extent. I would be agnostic in as much as I would think someone cannot be confident in their answer to the question of God's existence. The positions of Philo in Hume's dialogue are mostly in this epistemological vein, rather than the ontological one. And I think the value of this work is mainly in how it encourages us to sit back and ask just how sure we can be of our theological reasoning. Do our analogies between the material world and the immaterial one hold? Can we make sensible judgments about plausibility or possibility outside the universe? But this general approach is not just valuable in the realm of theology, it is a fantastic weapon in our philosophical toolbox. If we look at almost any contemporary debate, either philosophical or non-philosophical, we are almost always watching a clash between two sides. One side argues that euthanasia is moral, and the other argues that it's not. One side believes in the immortality of the soul, and the other doesn't. One group of people think that Jesus rose from the dead, while the other disagrees. In each case here, we are mainly looking at which proposition is true. Is euthanasia moral, or isn't it? Is the soul immortal, or does it perish? But running parallel to each of these debates is the question of our own certainty. For every what is the case, there is a corresponding how would we know what is the case, and moreover, how sure is our epistemic process? Beyond this, we can ask what are the kind of things it is possible for us to know, and which can we only guess or estimate? At the beginning of the video, I used David Hume's quote, "The wise man proportions his belief to the evidence." But another way of phrasing this same point is your beliefs about ontology depend on the strength of your epistemology. And this is a very helpful bit of advice. Hume challenges us not just to think about what we believe, but also the extent to which we believe it. And to keep one eye on our own limitations at all times when we're investigating the world. Because something both the theist and the atheist agree on is that the world is greater than us, possibly to the extent that we will never fully understand it. We are using the fallible tools of our own reasoning to engage with it, and to that extent we can never be 100% confident in what we believe. We are constantly making these tiny gambles with each and every decision we make or belief we take on. Skepticism gets a really bad rap these days, and it is for pretty good reason. It's associated with people wondering whether we are brains in vats or if the universe exists at all. In other words, things of seemingly little practical consequence. However, the true value of skepticism runs far deeper than this. Hume's style of skepticism is not to raise idle worries that we are wrong about everything, but instead to simply ask, what are the limits of the things we can know? And he places quite a lot of questions quite near the periphery of possible knowledge. For instance, Hume is a phenomenalist about the external world, meaning that he just says we cannot know if it exists. All we know is that our observations are ordered as if such an external world exists, so it's a very good working model. Likewise, Philo's position is essentially that whatever our purported answers to religious questions might be, we must be so unsure of them that there will always be a healthy amount of agnosticism mixed in with either our atheism or our theism. Philo is skeptical not just of the existence of God, but the answerability of the very questions God is supposed to help with. For him, the honest answer to questions about the metaphysical underpinnings of the universe or the origins of it or the nature of the divine is just a gentle shrug and an "I don't know." And there is a part of me that strongly rebels against this conclusion. These are some of the most important questions to answer. The issue of eternal life is on the table, and Hume just says we can't know. But for him, that is just tough luck. The limits of our knowledge do not care what is important to us, and it just so happens that since we have no precedent for arguing about what is outside the universe, we are a bit stuffed when it comes to having knowledge about it. Of course, we don't have to agree with Hume. I've not had space in this video to examine the criticisms of Hume's position, but suffice to say, there are many. But I want to end by highlighting the key question that I really do think is worth asking. When we are addressing an issue, any issue, be it philosophical or material or observational, it might be worth occasionally stepping back and asking what are the limits of what we can know here. From Socrates saying, "All I know is that I know nothing," to Descartes deciding to test the limits of his certainty, philosophy has a rich history of encouraging epistemic self-awareness. Perhaps we could do with a bit more of the agnostic spirit in our inquiries, both within theology and outside of it. But of course, alongside agnosticism, there are further debates to be had about whether God even can exist or whether his properties are contradictory. And if you want to check out that question, I have a video about it right here. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.